So I'll start with the benchmark check varieties that are in your mind, or what we're growing. I know I'm in durum country, and some guys here though are switching out to maybe some barley or some hard red spring wheat, something I've heard this past 2 years. I've never heard this in 24 years, but I heard it more this year than any time. Guys that grew some hard red spring in the durum country said, you know what, it's starting to yield as good as durum in the durum country. I've never heard that before. They say, why am I growing durum? I could grow hard red and actually market the stuff and not worry about grades and get as much yield. So anyway, it's just kind of an interesting change. I think our hard red spring wheat genetics are doing better and better all the time. This is crop insurance information. This is 2018 Brandon, top variety in Saskatchewan. It was the same as last year. Utmost still the second. Plentiful. Cardell, but Landmark, CDC Landmark has crept up onto the bottom of the top 5. And that's partly because it's a midge-tolerant wheat, and it's a shorter, stronger strawed version of the midge-tolerant wheat. So it's sort of one of our best midge-tolerant wheats that's available. So that's what a lot of the prairies is growing, and this also tells you on this list where there's seed available. There's a lot of seed available of those top 5. Landmark was first year this past spring, and so there's more seed of these around. If you're thinking of switching, these will be likely one that you'll be looking at. So I'm just going to talk about Brandon because it's sort of my benchmark variety. It's very similar to Carberry. Brandon, there it is, compared to Carberry, virtually the same height, but Brandon is just a little bit more floppy in the heads. Carberry, very, very upright little soldiers, I call it. And both are moderately resistant to Fusarium head blight. Brandon is probably the most popular on the prairies, partly because of that short, strong straw. I call it mid-thigh, so below my pocket line. So if I just drop my hand, that's where Brandon is. That's where the target height, that's the height I like to see. A lot of varieties are just a little bit taller than that. But it's also, so that short, strong straw, better yield than Carberry, about 5% better yield, and moderately resistant to Fusarium head blight with very good threshability. Those things put together have tended to make it a very popular variety. Again, that's Brandon toward maturity. Just another shot there. That's Brandon just showing kind of a floppy head, makes a very big fluffy swath if you're into swathing. Eli, that's a line seed court, sister line to Brandon, very, very similar, but it was intermediate to Fusarium head blight. And these are older, not exactly brand new, so I'm just going to cover them very quickly. AAC Redwater. That variety is an early maturing wheat. Now, I've never had guys cry at the trade show, but a few boys were crying at the trade shows because we're losing Redwater, moving to the CNHR class. A few guys have really fallen in love with this, especially in the Parkland region up north. But if down here, one strategy is to beat the heat. If you want to get something in the ground that's going to come off early and beat the heat, Redwater is one that's still in the hard red class, but moving in 2021 to CNHR. Anyway, intermediate to Fusarium head blight, but very good sprouting tolerance. So our strategy here was maybe to replace harvest. Harvest wheat had very good sprouting tolerance, good grade retention. But a little bit taller and not quite as strong straw as something as a Brandon. That's just something, this is for an Alberta shot. They grew a lot of Stettler out there, and this is somewhat similar but to Stettler in height, but very much earlier. CDC Titanium from crop production, I should have changed that to Nutrien. So that launched a few years ago, Titanium, a new midge-tolerant wheat, MR for Fusarium head blight. But sprouting was poor, lodging was poor, and fairly tall. So that is one of the reasons why Landmark has taken off, is partly because of shorter, stronger straw. Just for 2017, so we're coming a year ahead, I'm going to talk about Jetheria and Cameron. Those are sister lines, very, very similar to each other. I call those conventional height, and we'll talk a bit about CONNERY, Prevail VB, another midge-tolerant, and Bradwell, just very, very quickly, because we feel Bradwell has egg-laying deterrence, just as Tyler just talked about. So Jetheria, if any of you have heard of Unity VB, this is very, very similar with just a little bit better straw strength, a little bit better yield. So this is out there. There's seed available of this one. Had the better yield than Unity and intermediate to Fusarium head blight, but only fair for lodging. It's still not as strong strawed as we'd like in a midge-tolerant wheat. Just some data there. I'm going to just skip over these very quickly so I don't bore you to death. I usually dig in deeper to some of these varieties. That's just Jetheria next to Unity. They look very, very similar. Moving on to Cameron. Again, Cameron Jetheria, very, very similar. A little bit on the taller edge, taller end of the spectrum, and midge tolerant. And again, this one is intermediate to Fusarium head blight right there. This is through Cantera. Now, Cameron has shown up, partly I think because it's a little bit taller, it had a little bit better fusarium resistance out in Manitoba. So they had some articles showing that it had a lower dawn accumulation. It's a little bit better than we'd expect for intermediate for FHB, and that's partly, I think, because of it's a little bit taller, and if the heads are further off the ground, there tends to be less rain splash moving the fusarium spores onto the head. So that's out there too from Canterra. Another one from Canterra was AAC CONNERY. This is one of our few non-bearded wheats. So this one was MR for fusarium head blight, which is kind of a neat thing. It was non-bearded, and height was about 12 centimeters taller, but still it's pretty nice yield with the MR rating for fusarium head blight, but a little bit tougher to thresh. Would you agree with that, Lauren? So that's a non-bearded wheat, but it actually holds color and grade too. So kind of a nice wheat out there, but the threshability with rotary combines, just watch that one a little bit. This is Prevail VB. So this is from Ag Canada, a new CWRS from Alliance Seed Corp that launched last year, Colin? And spring of 17, a couple years ago. An intermediate for fusarium head blight, fairly tall, but that would also keep those heads off the ground further away from the fusarium. Good, fair for lodging, but good for sprouting. So that's just one in there. And a lot of these midge-tolerant wheats, I say the midge is always nibbling on our wheat. So as soon as we have the SM1 gene, most of those varieties tend to have a little bit better yield than sort of the midge susceptible. I think the midge SM1 gene probably just roughly gives 5% better yield in a lot of varieties, just because the midge seems to be nibbling away at the crop. That's just a shot of Prevail. Again, not bearded. Is that correct? You sent me the picture, so I hope it's right. But anyway, there's not very many of these non-bearded wheats out. Some people like a non-bearded wheat. So I just like to show them because I think 80 to 90%, well, probably 90% of our wheats will be bearded in the future for hard red spring. Just a shot of Bradwell. So this would be a little bit taller. So again, this would be, if Brandon was sort of below my pocket, this would be about 6 to 8 inches taller. This one is from Crop Development Center. The claim to fame here was really nice yields, good adaptation, but that egg-laying deterrence. So there's a crop. You wouldn't have to sign up for the stewardship agreement for midge tolerance, but you would get some reduced midge damage potentially. There's the Bradwell. It has very good for lodging, and intermediate for fusarium head blight. It's on, and a day earlier than Carberry. And that's what we call egg-laying deterrence. I think you called that, what was your other term?
Oviposition deterrence?
Oviposition, which means laying of eggs. Positioning the eggs. And that's Bradwell, so you can see Bradwell here, a little bit taller than Brandon. And there's Bradwell again, and so there's Brandon next to it. Brandon being a little bit more floppy. This one tends to be just a touch, stays green, so a very nice green late into the season. Seems to show fairly good health, leaf health. Moving on to 2018, so I'm going to spend a little more time here. We're getting into some stuff that's a bit more relevant. CDC Landmark, that launched this past spring in 2018. So that was the one that was 5th on the list. So that was first year of seed sales, Gordon?
Yeah,
2018. First year seed sales, it got up to 5th position, which is pretty good for a brand new variety. And so we'll talk about that, and then Viewfield too. And SY Slate from Syngenta. Anyways, I'm not going to say too much about Slate. It's through the Syngenta system. The lodging is poor, sprouting is poor, fusarium intermediate, and only 102 to 108% of Carberry. That speaks for itself, kind of thing. So AAC Viewfield. So from Ag Canada Swift Current, bearded wheat, probably our shortest, strongest strawed hard red spring wheat that's out there right now. This one is actually kind of neat, kind of surprising to me, because it shows about 5 to 10, this is in the Saskatchewan variety pamphlet, anywhere from 9. This is in the brown soils here, brown and dark brown, and this is up in the blacks. It actually does better than Carberry in the brown and dark brown soils, showing pretty good adaptation under warmer, drier conditions. So if we're heading into a warm, dry year, even though this is a shorter, stronger strawed variety, normally I used to think 25 years ago, short varieties didn't do well in the drought zone. But this variety breaks that mold, and it actually seems to do very well where it's warmer, drier, and you get less straw to manage. Very good lodging, good for sprouting. So one of the few varieties that's actually shorter than Carberry. Intermediate for Fusarium head blight, and a day earlier than Carberry. So overall, pretty nice variety. Yeah. So part of the reason I talk about these is too because, you know, if you got durum growers, there's not a whole lot of seed growers down in this part of the world. And where's the seed, and where can you go to get seed in? Is there seed available? So we have to, some of the varieties that have been out for a couple years, there is seed and you can source it. I want to move on to CDC Landmark VB, so new midge tolerant, launched last spring, bearded wheat. Out of the Crop Development Center, Pierre Huckel was the breeder. This was a very nice variety because it was really our first short and strong strawed midge tolerant wheat. Until this time, most of our wheat, midge tolerant wheats, were kind of taller and kind of floppy. And so this one was anywhere from 10 to 14% better than Carberry in our seed guide. So it's doing better, a little bit better in the north region and not quite as good down here, but still that's a very respectable yield. And some of that's from the midge tolerance gene, I think. Good lodging, good sprouting, and height a little bit taller than Carberry, so it's still just a touch taller, but probably our shortest midge tolerant wheat, but it's intermediate to Fusarium head blight. So we're not quite at a Brandon level of Fusarium resistance, but sort of our best one available at the moment, and a day earlier than Carberry. And the refuge is Viewfield. And you got a bit of seed of that one around still? New for 2019, so we're hitting this spring. We've got Tisdale, AAC Tisdale, AAC Redberry, and CDC Adamant VB. So that's a new midge tolerant. So CDC Adamant VB. Again with FP Genetics launching this spring, 8 to 14% better than Carberry for yield, so very respectable yield. Intermediate for Fusarium head blight, and a little bit taller, so that's more right in the, that's in the landmark zone. Lodging is rated as poor. So it's got a semi-solid stem. I believe that might have been from Unity type parentage, but that semi-solid is also in landmark. So those would both be options. Tisdale, this is launching this spring. This one is, what did I have there? Fusarium intermediate. This one's Fusarium is moderately resistant. So this is getting up into the Brandon Carberry level of Fusarium resistance, but earlier maturity. So we've got lodging and sprouting are fair, but this is the highest protein in the seed guide, and 2 days earlier than Carberry. So this is edging toward a replacement for Redwater, but not quite as early as Redwater, with a little bit better Fusarium resistance. So some of this was named for Tisdale partly because it fits up in that part of the world with the better protein and better Fusarium resistance. And earlier maturity, large seed, and a little bit, about 8 centimeters taller and weaker than Carberry. That's just a shot of it there, bearded wheat again, and that's Carberry on the left, Tisdale on the right with a little bit, you can see the height difference there. And that's Tisdale, a bit taller than Brandon. Just going to talk about Redberry from Alliance Seed Corp for a sec. So this one again is, partly because of the name, gives it away a little bit to help us have something a little bit earlier maturity for maybe to replace Redwater. That's Redberry again. And probably hard to read from the back. I'll just read a few of the key traits here. Parentage with Glen by Stettler. So this one is sort of a medium height semi-dwarf. Oh, we'll get back there. 6 centimeters taller than Carberry. Just got to get that right. They say 3 to 5 days earlier. I think it's in the seed guide 3 days earlier than Carberry. Intermediate for Fusarium head blight. So with good sprouting resistance. So that is moving toward that Redwater type replacement with earlier maturity, intermediate for Fusarium head blight, and some sprouting tolerance. I'm going to move ahead into future years now. So this is sort of interesting to see because Sask Wheat puts a lot of money into plant breeding or wheat breeding. And I just want to hit a few highlights from the varieties coming up. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Alida and Warman, and then a couple more that come in the next year. This one launches next year from Ag Canada Swift Current. This is, again, a midge tolerant. Probably going to have Brandon as the refuge. That 5 to 8 better yield than Carberry. But, and only 6 centimeters taller. So we're getting down close to the landmark height. So we're getting closer to Carberry height with this one. And getting the MR rating for Fusarium head blight. So the landmark is intermediate for Fusarium head blight. So we're getting closer to a midge tolerant type Brandon. It's kind of the hope is that we can get a Brandon type of thing. Still a bit taller than Brandon. Has low dawn accumulation. That's a good thing. That means just less vomitoxin building up. But it's very good. If you look in the seed guide, very good for lodging and very good for sprouting. Nice traits after that wet fall last fall, because some of the Brandon has had low falling numbers, because Brandon is rated poor for sprouting. So this one is going to have the good lodging, good sprouting. And so a very good disease package for the leaf rust, stripe rust, etc. And protein pretty close to carberry. Anyway, those are just some yield numbers there. This is Alida in the field. It's really tough to tell. I think this picture is better down lower. You can see just a little bit taller than Brandon. So there's been a lot of interest from seed growers in this one, and that'll launch next year. Again, that's just another shot. Just looks like a slightly taller version of the Brandon. And that's Tisdale to the left, Tisdale being the early one. Talk about Warman. So Warman would be a lot more like the Diphtheria or the Unity. It's coming up next year. So this would be sort of that more conventional height, midge tolerant again, about 11% better yield than carberry, a little bit earlier than carberry, 3 days earlier. 13 centimeters taller than carberry. So that's pretty high, tall, it's conventional height. But it's one of our first midge tolerant types, a tall type with the very strong, moderately resistant rating. So probably one of our best, most resistant to Fusarium in the hard red springs, low dawn accumulation. Even though it still gets the MR rating, it shows that low dawn accumulation and a very, very consistent ratings for lowered FHB infection, Fusarium infection. A little stronger straw than Unity, so even though it's tall, it's an improvement over the older ones like Diphtheria. And that's just a few pictures there. So that's Diphtheria, that's Warman, but they would look very close to this is Diphtheria and Unity. So sort of we're having stepwise improvements. Unity was one of our first midge tolerant, then we went to Diphtheria, and now to the Warman type. And this is Warman on this side versus Unity. They look very, very similar. I really want to spend a minute here on Starbuck, because that's kind of a neat little step forward for plant breeding, and to show some of the value you get from your money going into plant breeding. These are two lines that came out from Ag Canada last year. So Starbuck, again, is a bearded wheat with it's very, very close to something that we'd call like a midge-tolerant Brandon because of its height and Fusarium resistance. Just to get another shot here. So anyway, this is launching 2021, so we've got a couple years to wait. We're just starting to grow seed, multiply seed now. And it had 13 to 17% better yield than carberry in the seed guide, so that's a nice yield bump up. So part of that is, again, midge tolerance and plant breeding helping us to get some better yields going there. Maturity, it's not later, so it's at least 1 day earlier than carberry. Height is only 3 centimeters greater than carberry, so very, very close to a carberry Brandon type height. And we've got the MR rating and low dawn accumulation for Fusarium head blight, very good. Leaf and stripe rust are resistant, intermediate to stem rust. It is susceptible to bunt. Lodging was just slightly weaker than carberry, but not bad. It's very, very close to carberry, and it seemed to have a high falling number, which is much better sprouting tolerance than a Brandon. So this comes out from SeCan in a couple of years. If you think of that one as a midge tolerant Brandon, where you get the short, strong straw and the MR rating to Fusarium and the resistance to Fusarium, we just don't have the semi-solid stem or the solid stem for softfly. That's just a shot of, this is Starbuck. This is just a experimental line, but you can see it's kind of that mid-pocket height like a Brandon. And that's Starbuck and carberry side by side at irrigation and swift current. Just another shot of it there, Starbuck on the left, Brandon on the right, looking pretty close to each other. And then Wheatland came out very similar to Starbuck, similar yields, a little bit stronger straw, and that's Wheatland up at North Battleford. And again, mid-pocket height, but it was intermediate to Fusarium head blight. So that's the big difference there. It was very similar to Starbuck, but intermediate for Fusarium head blight and stronger straw than carberry. So that's going to talk very quickly about special purpose wheats. This is more for ethanol and feed. Just to hear the crop insurance thing is showing us here their acreage past year, one of our most widely grown, and Sadash is a soft white spring, and followed by Andrew. And then we've got a couple CPS red wheats down here at the bottom. So CPS wheats, I usually don't talk about in Saskatchewan. They're not super popular, partly because the elevators tend to seem to not want to handle them very much. They seem to want to give them a price discount. I just want to talk about a few of the CPS reds, just so you're familiar. From Alliance Seed Corp, we've got AAC Tenacious VB that's launched in 17. The claim to fame here is this is our only wheat variety right now that's R rated, so resistance rating is resistant to Fusarium head blight. It does not mean immune, it means it's got the best level of resistance in any wheat, but this one is also quite tall. And so it is 25 centimeters taller, almost a foot taller than Carberry. So it is the tallest, one of the tallest wheats. But that is a claim to fame that gives you some of the best Fusarium resistance. So it kind of lends credence to the theory that taller varieties tend to be a little bit more Fusarium tolerant. Anyway, that is a tall wheat, but it's got some pretty decent yields. This is Rhonda Powell. He's the retired wheat breeder from Swift Current that brought out varieties like Lillian and Carberry. And he's standing here beside Penhold, just doing the kind of this means it's standing upright. And so Penhold is a very short, strong-strawed CPS red wheat, fairly early in maturity, high protein. It's probably one of the higher protein CPS reds beside Goodwin. But anyway, that one has been fairly widely grown in Alberta as a foremost replacement. And I won't spend a lot of time, but it was our first CPS red with the MR rating, moderate resistant rating to Fusarium head blight, while Tenacious had the R rating. And that's just a shot of Penhold in central Alberta. And these guys, in this article said that crop did 137 bushels per acre on that dry land. It's fairly moist dry land out in central Alberta. So this is Penhold here on the right with Foray on the left. That just gives you a little idea of the height difference that's in some of these CPS red wheats. If you're going into a hot, dry year, I'd still probably look at growing something like a Foray or a little bit taller here. And this is probably one of the highest yielding CPS reds in the seed guide. And this one came through with anywhere from 16 to 20% of Carberry. One of our problems with CPS reds is we're getting improvements in the hard red spring wheats, up to 15 to 17% better yield than Carberry. And these ones are only doing 16 to 20%, so we don't have enough yield benefit in CPS red wheats to offset the reduction in price at the elevator. So CPS has been struggling a bit to keep up. There's just not quite as much money and breeding effort going into CPS red wheats. This is a GP wheat, a general purpose or special purpose wheat now from Alida Seed Corp. Anova, basically a soft white spring type. And this would be very similar to something like probably like a Sadash, and a little bit earlier maturing than past year, but susceptible to Fusarium head blight. SY Rowan, this is a new one from Alliance Seed Corp, CPS red. And this one here is, I just want to get make sure I'm right here. Excellent disease resistance, including strong MR rating for Fusarium head blight. So again, this is another CPS red with the MR rating for Fusarium head blight. And it comes out of the Syngenta program. And it's about, I think it's still ranking in that about, do you remember what it's rating versus Carberry in the seed guide? 119. So in that same 115 to 120 range kind of thing. It comes out of dark northern spring lines out of the state. So those are more like our hard red spring wheats here in Canada, sort of thing. So again, a beer to wheat. I just mentioning, so this is AAC Goodwin. This was actually very similar to the Rowan type parentage. This has Carberry, Cadillac as parents, not typical parents for CPS red, but this one was very high yielding when it came through. It's not very high yielding now in comparison to, say, a Starbuck, but it was about 114% of Carberry. So really, this is a CWRS, Canada Western Red Spring, that fell into the CPS red class. It didn't have quite the quality for a CWRS, but it has very nice high protein, so it's probably one of our higher protein CPS reds. Maturity and height are very similar to Carberry. And that's just a shot of Goodwin there, and that's Goodwin at Swift Current with Richard Cuthbert. Another shot there. And then you can see here it's pretty similar height to a Penhold. And I'm just going to move on to just a general purpose wheat. I mention these because of the ethanol plant down at Belle Plaine, and some guys are starting with cattlemen they're growing soft white spring wheats for silage because they stand up better than barley. So guys in around Lethbridge, especially if they have irrigation, lots of fertility with manure, they're finding they can grow these new CPS soft white spring wheat, they're late maturing, but they have very good straw strength. So we've got Sadash here has probably been the most widely grown soft white spring. We've got a new one here, GP 151, also called Awesome, AAC Awesome General Purpose, and AAC Paramount, the new soft white spring. Here's Andrew. This one is looking a bit later, but a slightly better yield when it came through co-op trials. So it's supposed to be 6% better yield, but in Saskatchewan Seed Guide, a lot of the soft white yields seem to be the same. So when we go to dry land, a lot of the soft whites yield mostly the same. But just something to mention that these can be growing here. They stand up well, and they are later maturing, but they can make very good silage too, and can be sold into the ethanol market. Just got to watch sprouting in these and susceptibility to bunt and fusarium head blight. Just want to mention pasture. So this is a very interesting variety. This one is a bred wheat from England. It actually is European parentage crossed to the Kansas State material. And because of that cross to Kansas State winter wheats, it has more tolerance to our conditions here. And even though it's very late maturing, stands up and it's non-bearded, but it stays green late in the season and then really quickly ripens up. And it's actually done way, way better than I ever thought it would here. I thought, oh my goodness, that's a late maturing European type, it's never going to go anywhere. But because of the Kansas State material in the background, it actually produces a pretty nice sample. Well, I'll compare it to some of these, like this one next to it is a European wheat called Belvoir. And so this is pasture where it's green. This is a European wheat that's registered here in Canada called Alderon. You can see this European wheat is very much shorter. This is a true feed wheat type thing. And these are very late. So that's just a height comparison. They're even shorter than pasture, but they're late and they lose test weight. If they get in hot and dry at the end of the season, they tend to lose test weight, where pasture tends to hang on to its test weight. So it has a bit more heat tolerance at the end of the season. So again, if you're thinking of growing something for feed or for ethanol, these work too. But these are quite late, so I'd gravitate more to the pasture. And this is Sparrow. This one is registered here in Western Canada, and it won this is the Field of Dreams out by Norquay, Saskatchewan, and I think it did 120 some bushel an acre out there on dry land. So they can be growing and they do yield, but you got to watch your test weights and if you're in hot dry at the end of the season. I'm going to move on to durum very quickly. I know I'm just kind of skimming the surface on a lot of these, but there's just too many to dig into depth. Transcend is our most widely grown. That's been for a couple of years. Brigades moved up to second from Strongfield. Strongfield's dropped down to third position, then Spitfire, and then Precision from CDC Precision from the Crop Development Center. Both Transcend and Brigade are MS star, so that star tells us they're still rated moderately susceptible, but they're at the better end of the range for resistance to fusarium head blight. And so they've picked up, and Transcend's also got some grade retention, holds color and grade, which is really huge in durum, and that's like our old variety Kyle's tended to have that trait. And it's interesting that the ones with MS star tend to be a little bit taller than the Strongfield. I'm talking, 2 to 3 to 5 centimeters, but they're a little bit on the taller end of the spectrum, similar to something like in the hard red springs, like something like, say, Tenacious had the R rating. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of these. Spitfire, this launched a couple years ago. This one was supposed to be one of our flagship varieties. It had about 10% better yield than Strongfield, a shorter, stronger straw, but was rated susceptible to fusarium. So this one, that's Spitfire there. You can still see a little bit of lodging here. This was up at Saskatoon Kernan Farm a couple falls ago. And so that's it again. Overall, nice durum, but the susceptible rating to fusarium head blight has held it back a little bit, but it does have better straw strength. A couple new lines that launched back in 17 were CDC Fortitude. That was a solid stem, soft fly tolerant durum from the Crop Production Services, now Nutrien, and moderately susceptible to fusarium head blight. Lodging was fair. And CDC Carbide VB, so that was a midge tolerant durum from Crop Production Services from the Crop Development Center. Midge tolerant, but poor for lodging and moderately susceptible to fusarium too. Just want to mention these are Strongfield stems. Some of you guys might have done this before. Cut stems. You can see the hollow lumen, hollow stem there, versus something like this was AAC Raymore. So this is one of our first solid stem derms that hit the market. I called it a prototype because it was actually lower yielding than Strongfield, and we've got much better varieties now. But that just tells you how solid those stems are. So if we really had a sawfly issue, it's a no-brainer. If you want to control sawfly, you'd grow solid stem durum because it's very solid. The pricing of the grain is a whole nother matter if you want to grow it or not. So anyway, this is Raymore up here versus the other hollow stem derms like Strongfield and Avonlea. So just a few new varieties that launched in 18. Cabri, Precision, Alloy, Dynamic. So Precision, Alloy, and Dynamic all came out of the Crop Development Center all the same year. One variety went to Alliance Seed Corp, FP Genetics, and then for Nutrien. Just a really quick overview of these. Cabri, solid stem, sawfly tolerant, about 5% better than Strongfield, so an improvement over the Raymore. Lodging was equal to Strongfield, a touch taller than Strongfield, and has that moderately susceptible rating, MS rating. And that's, a lot of the derms fall into that MS category. And that's just a shot. So Raymore's pretty much dead. Cabri will take over for now. This is a bit of Cabri lodging besides Strongfield, so we've got a little bit of lodging going on there. Versus a Stronghold. So this is another fairly new one from SeCan that'll launch in another year. And this one is solid stem and the shortest, strongest straw durum, and it gets a very good rating for standability. So Precision, this one came out launched in 2018. This one had a lot of buzz in the seed guide. It was 8 to 11% better than Strongfield, so it was actually the highest yielding durum in the seed guide for 1 or 2 years. This latest seed guide has dropped down a little bit. So I asked some of the breeders about that. This again had a lot of interest because it was the top yield. But it came through the co-ops in sort of the wetter years, so it did really well in some of those wetter years, but we had a couple of years in the provincial trials of warmer, drier, and it's tended to move down into about 8 or 10% better than the Strongfield. So it now is 8 and 11% better than Strongfield. So it's, yeah, I think I updated that for there. So it's still a very good yielder, and lodging was good, MS for fusarium head blight. Height a little bit shorter than Brigade, but a little bit taller than Strongfield. Same time came out Alloy from FP Genetics and Dynamic. So these all were about 10% better yielding than Strongfield. All of them are just a little bit taller than Strongfield, and all MS for fusarium head blight. So this is for Alloy. Is that one on the market, Gordon?
Yeah, it launched last year.
Last year, yeah, okay. Some new varieties coming up for this coming year. So this spring is AAC Congress from Cantera and Stronghold from SeCan. So that's Congress, about 7 to 9% better than Strongfield, a day later than Strongfield. A little bit taller, lodging is poor, test weight similar to the Czechs. FHB, moderately susceptible. And that's, so that's, again, just another shot of the head. And I'm just going to mention Stronghold. So this one is the shortest and strongest straw durum with a very good rating for straw strength. I got out of order there before, but so this is up at the Kernan farm last fall, and you can see all the durums are starting to go floppy, and Stronghold right here that Rhonda Powell was standing beside is just completely upright. This one is actually surprising me because, and you can see here, so we backed up and got up high, and you can see all the lodging, I call it floppiness in the durums around it, but Stronghold, the plots, and right there too, very, very upright. So and you may not be worried about that this year, but if you've got high moisture conditions or irrigation in this area, I would recommend Stronghold. As soon as I go north of the normal durum area, I say, you know what, durum can be floppy, look at Stronghold, because that, if it stands up, just a little bit like our using our growth regulators, if it stands up, I think it can help you save 20% of your yield. So anyway, our seed growers have grown it. Even though it shows about 5% better yield than Strongfield, seed growers that have grown, I said, wow, that really has done well for me. So it's a little bit shorter than Strongfield, and it's moderately susceptible to fusarium head blight. Just going to talk about Credence, CDC Credence. This is coming out next year from Cantera, launch in 2020. And this one has the MS star. So there'll be some interest in that one because of the MS star rating, again from the Crop Development Center. Fair lodging and 6 to 10% better yield than strong field. So that's coming up next year.